who go after international and domestic terrorism, cyber criminal syndicates, foreign espionage, organized criminal enterprises, including drug cartels, sexual exploitation, and human trafficking, and many other crimes that affect our lives and the lives of everyday Americans across the country. All different backgrounds, races, religions can be victims of crime that the FBI investigates. And the FBI agents put their lives on the line because pursuing these crimes often puts them at risk from bad guys who may not even know that they're shooting at an FBI agent, but it's somebody pursuing them. They may not know that an FBI agent is operating undercover, and they may be killing him. And so the FBI's work is a dangerous business, but it is for our good and our safety. The American people deserve an FBI leader who is worthy of them. The American people deserve a director of the FBI who will keep them safe and who will make that safety a priority. But in recent weeks, the Trump administration has systematically weaponized and politicized both the FBI and the Department of Justice. On her very first day of office, Attorney General Bondi created a, quote, weaponization working group. Let me repeat that. Weaponization working group. And specifically named targets to be investigated: Letitia James, Alvin Bragg, Jack Smith. All of them have led legitimate prosecutions and lawsuits against President Trump. There have been reports that prosecutors and FBI agents have been reassigned from drug trafficking to do immigration enforcement, from terrorism task forces to immigration enforcement. And the administration has issued allegedly unethical or illegal orders, causing many top prosecutors to bravely resign rather than betray their oaths of office. We're talking about men and women who love their jobs in the Department of Justice and do them well. And they have sacrificed those jobs because they were ordered to take action that was unethical or illegal in their view. We need now more than ever an FBI director who is trustworthy and devoted to the ideals and values of the Department of Justice and the Constitution above all. Anyone taking one of those jobs raises their right hand and swears an oath to the Constitution, not to the President, not to the Attorney General, not to any other official. It is to the Constitution. Kash Patel is not that person, not the person to have that immense responsibility, most especially at this moment. He lacks the judgment, he lacks the integrity, he lacks the character and competence to be FBI director. Kash Patel's contempt for those agents who put their lives on the line has been clear. He's called them, the FBI, one of the most cunning and powerful arms of the deep state. And there are now highly credible whistleblower reports that he may have directed the purging of senior leaders at the FBI, as well as potentially a mass firing of career FBI officials. Those FBI officials who served professionally with distinction, put their lives on the line, purged as a result of Kash Patel involving himself, in fact, in those decisions, even as under oath, in response to my questions, He said, quote, "All FBI employees will be protected against political retribution." All FBI employees will be protected against political retribution. Well, we stood in front of the FBI headquarters this morning. In that very building, there are individuals who will be fired because they took assignments. They didn't choose, they were assigned to criminal investigations that happened to involve Donald Trump. Political retribution at its very height. And if he directed the purging of those FBI agents, contrary to the assurances he made to our committee at his nomination committee, Kash Patel was certainly less than truthful with us. I have not been without criticism of the FBI. None of us have been. No agency is perfect. But I am also betting that members of the FBI would say there's room for improvement in this agency. Kash Patel would slash and trash the FBI, not improve it. He would engage in political retribution, not constructive reform. He would weaponize the FBI with that enemies list. He may not say it's an enemies list. He may call them government gangsters. But that manhunt would involve political retribution. And he has conspiracy theories. He's trafficked in them. He said he agrees with a lot of what QAnon says. He engages in election denialism, refusing to say that President Biden won the 2020 election. He's even suggested that the FBI planned the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And he has glorified those rioters by calling them political prisoners and, in fact, aiding them in their defense. Even the rioters who attacked and assaulted police officers and did them grave injury and in some instances contributed to their deaths. He has joined them in song, producing the J6 choir's recording. And he has refused to be honest when it really matters, pleading the Fifth Amendment in the case about Donald Trump's handling of classified documents, and then denying us, or at least refusing to cooperate in providing us with access to the testimony that he offered. The litany of questionable comments, actions by this nominee shows he lacks the character and competence for this job. I've talked about roughly half a dozen various different facts in his background, statements, comments, actions that would be individually disqualifying. Altogether, they paint a picture of someone who has no proper role anywhere near a law enforcement agency, let alone director of the FBI. I'm appalled that my Republican colleagues voted for him in committee unanimously on their side. I'm appalled that so few may vote against him on the floor today. But I am absolutely sure of this one thing. This vote will haunt anyone who votes for him. They will rue the day they did it. To my Republican colleagues, think about it. Think about what you will tell your constituents, more important, your family, maybe your grandchildren, about why you picked and voted for this person who will so completely and utterly disgrace this office and do such grave damage to our nation's justice system. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President, I ask permission to speak up to 10 minutes. Without objection, the senator from Vermont is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank my colleagues for joining me here today. I oppose Kash Patel and believe he is the dangerously wrong choice to serve as the director of FBI. We all have great admiration for the FBI. The men and women there serve our nation, do hard work every day, and for decades they've served as a non-political agency that protects us and defends the rule of law. I believe that Mr. Patel is on a mission to wreck the FBI. It's his own words. He wants to turn the FBI building into a monument or museum to the deep state. You know, I believe that this country and Congress is in the midst of a slow-moving but rapidly accelerating constitutional crisis. This is real, and we can ignore it or see it. It began most visibly, of course, in January 6, 2021, when two norms of this republic, the peaceful transfer of power and the renunciation of violence to affect the outcome of a vote count and certification, were breached, and where many members of the House and Senate also voted against certifying the election of the person chosen by the people in their own states. The president continues to say that the election was stolen, and he has coached his nominees to embrace the big lie. Mr. President, the first month of the Trump administration has shown a contempt for the Constitution, an acceptance of lawlessness that is dangerous to the future of our republic. President Trump's election denialism was only an early sign of his disregard for the norms and requirements of the Constitution. Now empowered in a second term by a Congress and a judiciary which refused to assert their independence, Mr. Trump has enacted executive order after executive order to dismantle our institutions. He doesn't have the authority to do what he's doing. The federal funding freeze, clearly unconstitutional, invasion of the Article 1 power of the purse, shutting down agencies created by Congress without authority, revoking birthright citizenship, a constitutional provision that he asserts he can do by executive order, removing leaders of independent agencies created by Congress, clearly unlawful, firing inspectors general in violation of notice requirements created by Congress, unlawful, firing government employees who have civil service protections, clearly unlawful, and pushing, really, a quid pro quo order at the Department of Justice to drop charges against a corrupt mayor in New York so he'll accede to whatever the wishes are of the Trump administration regarding local enforcement. And that's only a short list. And we have reached a point where a federal judge has found that the White House defied his order to release billions of dollars in federal grants, marking the first time that a judge has expressly declared that the Trump administration is disobeying a judicial mandate. That is trouble. The country is headed into a situation where, in addition to acting without authority, the president and his enablers are indicting, he will defy rulings from the third branch of our government. Vice President Vance has made it very clear what his point of view is on judges. Judges aren't allowed to control the executive's, quote, legitimate powers. And if the courts don't like it, let them enforce it. Of course, under our Constitution, since Marbury versus Madison, the court is the final arbiter of what is legitimate or what is not. And the executive branch must enforce the laws as interpreted by the co-equal branch of government. Mr. President, it is my view that this administration is showing maximum contempt for core constitutional values, including, most importantly, the separation of powers. This is not about what the president's agenda is. This is about his disregard about the limits that apply to each branch of government. And we have a dilemma. There are many in Congress that are fully in support of President Trump's policies. That's his right to pursue them. any member's right to support them. But it has to be that we accept our unique responsibility, each of the 100 U.S. senators, that we have to guarantee that in pursuit of those policies, it is done within constitutional boundaries. That is the glue that has held this country together through thick and thin for nearly 250 years. You know, this is not just talk about civic aspiration. It's a recognition that the separation of powers, that the system of checks and balances, we're custodians of that, each of us here. That the concept of the executive's ambition should be matched with the ambition of the legislature. That's what's held us together through the turmoil of our own history. We have fierce debates about important public policy matters, but what allows us to resolve them, despite intense disagreements, is staying within the guardrails of the Constitution. That process is being threatened directly and aggressively. The president's attack on our Constitution on January 6th has continued to this day. We've witnessed a renunciation of the decision that the American people made in the 2020 election by President Trump's nominees. Many of them who came before us, including Mr. Patel, were unable to simply say who won the 2020 election. They continued the Stop the Steal narrative even 4 years later. And now we have President Trump in his first month in office acting in ways that continues to challenge the constitutional order. I'm voting against Mr. Patel primarily, but not exclusively, because he's clearly an instrument in that effort to continue eroding the precepts of the Constitution on separation of powers. And I urge all my fellow senators, Republican and Democrats, to embrace the responsibility we have to assert our responsibility and authority as a co-equal branch. This is a difficult time, particularly for many of my esteemed colleagues on the Republican side. You may support, as I mentioned, the policies of the president, but we've got to take a look at how he is going about trying to implement them. That really matters. We are all custodians of the constitutional order. I'm regarding what President Trump has been doing in his first month in office as an illegal rampage. It's a rampage of illegality. He's showing a contempt for Congress and a contempt for the United States judiciary. Mr. Patel has signed on to that agenda. He isn't just someone who will be forced to participate in the president's campaign of retribution. He's an active participant. He's got his enemies list. We know this because his own words said what was the FBI doing planning January 6th for a year. No basis for that other than to set up the attack on the good men and women of the FBI. Mr. Patel is the one who created a list of deep state individuals. This is like Russia kind of stuff, half of whom are Republicans in the so-called deep state. And he called it nothing more than a cabal of government gangsters and allies. This is the department he's going to be leading, really. And he's the one who said, thank you to President Trump for helping put so many government gangsters in their place. Mr. President, Mr. Patel is not the person to lead the FBI. And my hope is that all of us should consider what Mr. Patel will do. He's going to use the power of the FBI to go after all those in government, those in the media, and those across the country he doesn't agree with. He cannot serve as the next director of the FBI. I yield back.
All post-cloture time has expired. The question occurs on the nomination. Do I hear a sufficient second? There appears to be a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt-Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Brett. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno,
Aye.
Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, sir. Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Britt, Budd, Cassidy, Cotton, Ernst, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hyde-Smith, Kennedy, Moreno, Paul, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Tillis, and Young. Senators voting in the negative: Duckworth, Durbin, King, Lujan, Murkowski, Murphy, Padilla, Peters, Sanders, Warner, and Welch. Ms. Slotkin, no. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mr. Schatz, no. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Husted, Mr. Husted, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Justice, aye. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Ms. Alsobrooks, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no.
No.
Mr. Kim, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, no. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Fetterman. Mr. Fetterman, no. Mrs. Smith. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Bennett, no. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Curtis, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, no.
The yeas are 51. The nays are 49. The confirmation is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions. I recognize the senator from South Carolina.
Thank you very much to my colleagues. We'll soon be starting what is commonly called a vote-a-rama. If you've never been in one, it's okay. But no, it's a chance to have a spirited discussion and debate about policy and about the budget resolution. So what's happened here is that the Budget Committee reported out Senate Concurrent Resolution 7 that will allow through the reconciliation process the spending of money and the reduction of spending based on different committees. This resolution allows for $175 billion of border and immigration policy enhancements, but it doesn't spend a penny. It allows the Judiciary Committee and the Homeland Security Committee to come up with up to $175 billion plan to secure our border and do immigration reform. And what will happen is that those two committees, Mr. President, will work with the Trump administration to meet their priorities. There's nothing in this resolution directing one dime of spending, and no spending bill can be implemented without presidential signature. So I want to make sure that's clear. There's $150 billion in increased defense spending. Why? Because we have a lot of threats. Since the withdrawal of Afghanistan, radical Islam is on the rise. We've got a hot war with Russia and Ukraine. Israel's facing enemies on 7 sides. We've provided weapons to our allies in Ukraine and Israel. We've run out of 155 howitzer rounds for a while. We've got to reinforce our industrial base. We need more money into our military yesterday to make sure that we can deter a war. And if we get them to a war, we win it. So the $150 billion will be allocated by the Armed Services Committee. We don't direct how the $150 billion is spent. We just allow the Armed Services Committee to spend that much if they choose. They decide what to spend it on. So this idea that there's somehow money in this resolution for Ukraine or any other specific purpose is not true. All we do is create a number for the committees to mark up to, and it's up to the committee as to what is in the $150 billion package. And to all the colleagues here, you'll eventually get to vote on that work product. And if you don't like it, you can vote no, and eventually that work product will have to be signed by the president. So that's the way the process works. But what we're doing today is jump-starting a process that will allow the Republican Party to meet President Trump's immigration agenda through the reconciliation process. And the Democrats used this very process to pass Obamacare and the Inflation Reduction Act. We're going to use it to secure our border. We're not going to grow the government just for the sense of growing the government. We're not going to create the Green New Deal. We're going to create border security transformational in nature. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to embark on a plan to jumpstart the most transformational border security bill in the history of the United States, because we need it yesterday. We've had 11 million people come to this country legally. Fentanyl kills 3,000 Americans every 2 weeks. It comes across that southern border. We're running out of detention space to hold people. Tom Holman, the border czar, came to the Republican Senate last week or 2 weeks ago and said that ICE is out of money. This resolution jumpstarts the process to get Tom Holman the money he needs to fill the promises we made, to build more detention beds so you don't have to let people go. Laken Riley's murderer was in detention and released because of lack of bed space, wound up killing the young lady. That should never happen again. When you're detained, we should hold you and process you according to law, not release you. We need more detention beds. We need to finish the wall. This $175 billion will be allocated by the committees in question, and it will allow President Trump to finish the wall, secure the border, and deport criminals. ICE is out of money. If you think it's a good idea to go after the criminal gangs that have come here over the years illegally, then you're right. To my Democratic colleagues, you should be working with us, not against us. Everybody should want to clean up the mess of the last 4 years. Everybody should want to go after criminal gangs. Everybody should want to secure the border because it's a national security nightmare. And nobody should want the dilemma of a nation having to let somebody go who could potentially be dangerous because you have no place to put them. This $175 billion will allow the most transformational border security bill in the history of the country at a time of great need. The $150 billion will be allocated by the Armed Services Committee. They'll decide what to spend it on, but there's a lot of modernization we need of our nuclear triad fleet. We need more weapons. Our stockpile is low. There's a bunch of things we can spend $150 billion on, but we'll let the Armed Services Committee decide those priorities. When it comes to the border security, $175 billion plan, the committees of jurisdiction will allocate that money, not this resolution. But without this resolution, we can't move forward. Why is this resolution important? Without this bill passing, Senate Concurrent Resolution 7, there is no hope of getting money for the border the way it needs to be done. Without this resolution passing tonight or early tomorrow, we're not going to get any money for the military without having to negotiate non-military spending increases. We don't have a lack of spending problem in our country. We have spent way too much on things that don't matter enough. Part of this process will be committees finding offsets, reducing spending. So we're telling the Armed Services Committee, spend $150 billion the way you see fit. We're telling 2 committees to spend $175 billion to secure our border. And we're telling 7 other committees, find savings inside your committee to offset the spending we're creating in this bill. I think they can do that. I think what DOGE is doing is good. This is a form of that. Every committee that's been instructed to save at least $1 billion will be able finally to go into the committee itself, what they spend on, and reduce spending because we're directing them to. My hope is that the $342 billion we're going to spend to secure our border, help the military, enhance the Coast Guard, will be offset with $342 billion of cuts in other parts of the government. We can do it, but this resolution has to pass or we won't do it. I'm highly confident that the Republican chairman of the committees in question will deliver. I'm highly confident that we can find savings in the government to offset the spending we're creating. The Democratic Party used this process for the Green New Deal. They used this process for Obamacare. We're using this process to help our military, who needs help, to secure a border that's been broken, and enhance the Coast Guard. That's the difference. We're doing things that need to be done to make us safe. 3,000 Americans die every 2 weeks because fentanyl comes across the border. We're going to fix that. Since President Trump's been in office, border crossings have gone down by 90%. We want to reinforce its success. We want to finish that wall. We want to make sure we never release another person in this country because we don't have a bed. We're going to make sure that the criminal gangs keep leaving, not staying, because the ICE doesn't have enough money. Why are we doing this? Because Tom Holman and Mr. Voigt, the head of OMB, told us 2 weeks ago we're out of money to finish the job that President Trump started. To my House colleagues, I prefer one big, beautiful bill that makes the tax cuts permanent, that does the things we need to do on the border and with our military and cuts spending. I wish you all the best. I prefer what you're doing to what we're doing, but we got to have a plan B if you can't get it done soon. What is the Senate doing? We've decided to front-end load security. We want to cut taxes. We want to make the tax cuts permanent. We're going to work with our House colleagues to do that. They expire at the end of the year, but we have time to do that. It is the view of the Republican Senate that when it comes to border security, we need not fail. We should have the money now to keep the momentum going. When it comes to the Republican Senate, we believe the military needs money now because the world's on fire. To my House colleagues, we will all get there together. If you can pass the one big, beautiful bill that makes the tax cuts permanent, not 4 or 5 years, then we'll all cheer over here. Nothing would please me more than Speaker Johnson being able to put together the bill that President Trump wants. I want that to happen, but I cannot sit on the sidelines and not have a plan B. This nation is under threat. The illegal immigrants who have come here by the millions need to be sent back by the millions. The border needs to be secured. The wall needs to be finished. We need more detention space. We need to upgrade our military capability now. The reason we're doing it now is because we were told ICE is out of money now. So I'm hoping that the House can deliver, but I am very confident that the Senate, early in the morning, Republicans, not one Democrat vote, will set in motion a process that will transform our border security to the most modern, aggressive border security plan in the history of the country, north and south. That will set in motion $175 billion of new spending to secure the border in a way that's never been achieved in the past. If this resolution fails, God help us all. If this resolution passes, help is on the way. If you believe that America needs to be serious about securing our border, this bill gets the job done. If you believe the military needs to be stronger, not weaker at a time of threat, this bill gets it done. If you believe the Coast Guard needs more capability to deal with drugs and national security threats, this bill delivers. This is a security bill. This is a bill that will combat fentanyl killing Americans. There are more Americans dying every 2 weeks from fentanyl than on 9/11. Hundreds of thousands of young Americans, young and old, but mostly young, have died from fentanyl poisoning coming across that southern border. We're going to go after those cartels. I'm confident that President Trump is the new sheriff in town that we need. But without resources, it won't work. Tom Homan came to us and begged us for money to continue the plan he's enacted to get gangs out of this country, to secure that border, to have more detention space. Tom, we heard you. We're going to meet your needs. So I'm excited about this debate. I'm excited about Republican-led committee chairman, finding ways to reduce spending to pay for this. This is a big deal, folks. The Republican Party is going to go all in on border security. We're going to upgrade our defense capability, and we're going to pay for it. Anybody at home ever had to pick between two things? You couldn't be everything. You couldn't have it all. That you had to spend because your child got sick or hurt, and you had to cut somewhere else because there wasn't enough money to do both. We're going to set priorities. If you have a sick child or something bad in your family happens, that goes first. That means you have to pinch somewhere else, except in Washington. Well, that model's over. We're going to start a new way of doing business. We're going to spend on things that need to be done and should be done by the federal government to keep us safe, and we're going to offset it by reducing spending in areas not as important. I'm excited about this process. I urge my colleagues to come down on both sides of the aisle and participate in this debate. This is what I was elected to do, I think. Make America safe and prosperous, and do it in a fiscally responsible way. The idea that we're going to actually offset spending is a great day. We're going to deliver. This is going to go into the night. Our Democratic colleagues are going to have a chance to offer a lot of amendments to our approach. And they will want this and they will want that. But what breaks my heart is they don't see the value in what we're trying to do. Every American should want more money into DHS to secure our border. Every American should want more capability in the hands of the military at a time of great threat. But we can't get there. We can't reach common ground on those issues. So we're going to use the process they used. They used the process to create Obamacare, the Green New Deal, the Inflation Reduction Act. We're going to use that very same process to make the cartel's life miserable, to go after criminal gangs, to finish the wall, upgrade the capability of the Coast Guard, and make our military the most lethal it's been since Ronald Reagan. And we're going to pay for it all.
No, they said to wait.
What? In a bit, not now I've been told, I will read a script that starts the process to the senator from Ohio, the presiding officer. This is why you came. This is what you promised to do. I was on the campaign with you, and you looked your voters in the eye and said, we're going to do things differently.